I found out that my grandfather, my dad, and the devil were actually the same person. I'm Melvin, and I'm 17. I've lived with my grandparents and Aunt Sam since I was little, and I've never met my parents. I've always felt loved by my grandmother and Aunt Sam, but not by my grandfather. I feel like there's always been a gap between me and my grandfather that just can't be closed. He's never really shown me any words of care or loving gestures. When I was 10, I used to run home from the bus stop all excited. The sound of kids crying left me feeling really confused. When I walked into the living room, I saw my grandmother holding a baby wrapped in a blanket, and she was crying too. "Come here, Melvin. This is your little brother, Henry." I was really curious. As a 10-year-old, I had a lot of questions, like why I suddenly had a younger brother, and whether he was born by our mother, Carrie.
You're not allowed to ask questions that go against any instructions from adults.
My grandfather's voice sounded really annoyed when he heard my questions. Aunt Sam quickly pulled me over to see my brother, but I was in tears because I felt sorry for myself and didn't really feel anything for Henry. I stayed in the room that my grandmother said was my mom's room, and Henry stayed with my grandparents since he was too young. I asked my grandmother about my parents many times, but she just smiled with a red, tearful face. My grandmother always told me to keep the room just as it was, down to the smallest details. The picture showed a very young and beautiful woman, and my grandmother said that that was my mother, Carrie. I don't have any information about my father, and neither do my grandparents. I don't share many traits with my mother, but resemble my grandfather more, and I really don't like that. I've had insomnia since I was a kid, probably around 7 or 8 years old, because of all the different noises. Sometimes it was the laughter of kids, and other times it was the crying and scolding. I could never quite pinpoint where it was coming from. I told my grandmother everything because she always listened to me.
Stop making up stories and asking for things.
My grandfather's voice sounded annoyed when he overheard me telling my grandmother that the room needed better soundproofing. My grandmother didn't have much of a say in the house because she didn't work. The whole family relied on my grandfather's salary for all the expenses. I saw my grandfather get angry with her many times, even throwing away the dinner she had just made because she mentioned my mother. She wanted him to spend some money to hire a detective to find my mother, Carrie. My grandfather didn't seem to care about my mother, so I could kind of understand why he didn't show much love for my siblings and me. Because I was really afraid of my grandfather and didn't want to cause any trouble for my grandmother, I tried to put up with those noises for many years. Sometimes, hearing the laughter of the kids made me laugh too. I also have a younger brother, Henry, but we always had to follow my grandfather's strict rules, so we were all pretty closed off. As I grew up, I always planned to visit my mother and ask her why she didn't bring my brothers and me along, or why she never came to visit us. One day, the family dinner took a serious turn when my grandfather announced that he was at risk of losing his job. At night, I heard the two adults arguing about money and some illness, along with the sound of a child crying. I put a pillow over my ears, but I couldn't block out the annoying noise. "It sounds like it's Grandpa." I sat up and walked around the room, trying to find a spot where I could hear the noise as clearly as possible. The woman's scream was really loud, and then the argument stopped. I had a lot of doubt about the man's voice. For almost a week now, the noise I've been hearing every night is a mix of a child crying and a woman's soothing voice. Of course I can't sleep. The child's crying might mean they're uncomfortable or sick. I know this from seeing my grandmother take care of Henry when he was little. She gently held Henry, comforted him, and sang him a lullaby with a worried and tired expression. A noise that sounded like a door opening came from right outside. I quietly went to open the door, and it was my grandfather. He must be thirsty. I figured that since there was a bathroom in my grandparents' bedroom, he wouldn't use the one in the living room. I followed him down to the living room, and instead of turning right to go to the kitchen, my grandfather turned left. I kept a safe distance so he wouldn't notice me and kept following him. My grandfather went into the basement. I waited until he was inside, then I hurriedly followed him. But by the time I got to the basement, my grandfather had disappeared. I walked around looking for him but couldn't find him, and I started wondering if I was dreaming. I decided to sit in a hidden corner and wait, and eventually I fell asleep. The sound like a lock made me jump awake. I was surprised when my grandfather appeared out of nowhere and left the basement. I didn't tell my grandmother, but decided to keep an eye on my grandfather for a few more days. For the next 3 days, my grandfather didn't do anything out of the ordinary and didn't go to the basement again. I was tormented by the sound of a little girl crying and the woman's constant cursing. In her scolding and cursing, she mentioned Mark, my grandfather. I grew more and more curious about my grandfather and was sure he was hiding some kind of secret. On the 4th night, I saw my grandpa pulling back a shelf in the basement, and it opened up to another basement behind it. While I was still in shock, my grandpa led a woman holding a little girl, and they both ran out of the basement in a hurry. The woman's face looked a lot like my mom's. I didn't really react, and I'm not sure what I was feeling at that moment. I just stayed in that corner of the basement until the next morning. The police, along with my grandparents, Aunt Sam, and the woman who looked like my mom, came back. With the police urging him on, my grandpa reopened the door to the other basement. 4 more people came out one by one, all calling the woman Mom and my grandpa Dad. My grandmother immediately collapsed and gasped. I ran over to hug her, and everyone was surprised. The strange woman looked at me, burst into tears, and called my name. The whole truth about my parents, the 2 people I had been longing to see for 17 years, was finally revealed. The noises I heard every night were from my mom and my siblings, who had been living in a dark, cramped basement. My mom had been imprisoned for 24 years by her own father, someone I didn't know whether to call Dad or Grandpa. I had 7 siblings in total. It should have been 8, but one of them died because my mom was abused while she was 7 months pregnant. My grandfather took Henry and me upstairs because the basement was too cramped and told us that my mom had abandoned us. I can't forgive the person who committed this terrible crime, but he did create my 7 siblings. Mother Carrie endured extreme physical and mental pain. Even though she hated the person who took away her future and happiness, she always said that she loved and protected all of us at all costs. I love my mom and my other siblings a lot, for I'm the lucky one. I've decided to move on and live a new, happy life with my grandmother, Mother Carrie, Aunt Sam, and my 6 siblings. But I never stopped wondering why my grandfather did such horrible things to his own daughter. The story is based on a real-life event about the tragic life of a girl named Elizabeth Fritzl. Her real dad is Joseph Fritzl, a messed up, creepy guy. He started abusing his daughter Elizabeth when she was just 11. When Elizabeth was growing up, she tried to run away from her monster of a dad a bunch of times, but it never worked. For 7 years, starting when Elizabeth was 11, Joseph started working on turning the basement into a prison. On August 28, 1984, when Elizabeth was only 18, he drugged her and locked her up in the dark basement. He raped her every day, and after 24 years, Elizabeth had 7 kids with him, going through unimaginable pain and humiliation. In April 2008, Joseph finally let his oldest daughter, Kristen, who was really sick, go to the hospital. From there, the truth came out, and the whole world saw the face of a monster.